The rain fell on Rome with a fury that felt biblical. It wasn't the gentle spring shower that washed the cobblestones clean, but a cold, relentless deluge, as if the heavens themselves were weeping in anger. Lightning fractured the bruised purple sky, momentarily illuminating the magnificent, somber dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Inside the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican, far from the public eye, an old man shivered, though not from the chill that seeped through the ancient stone walls. Father Alessandro, keeper of the apostolic archives, sat in his small lamplit scriptorium, his hands trembling as he held a steaming cup of tea. For 60 years, he had been the silent guardian of secrets, the custodian of letters and decrees that could rewrite history. He had seen popes come and go, their reigns mere paragraphs in the immense, sprawling narrative of the Church. But this was different. The news delivered in a somber, crackling voice over a small radio on his desk had not just brought sorrow. It had brought a dread so profound, so icy, that it felt like a shard of glass in his soul. His Holiness, Pope Francis, has passed away peacefully. The words echoed in the silence of the room, a stark, final pronouncement. Alessandro closed his eyes. Tears welled, for he had loved Francis, the humble man who washed the feet of prisoners, the man who spoke of mercy with a fire that rekindled hope in a cynical world. But another emotion, colder and sharper than grief, gripped him. It was the terror of knowledge. The terror of a secret he had guarded his entire life, a secret locked away in the most secure vault of the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. With a resolve born of grim necessity, he pushed himself to his feet. His joints ached, each step a protest. He ignored the tea, now growing cold. There was something he had to see, something he had to confirm with his own eyes, though his heart already knew the truth. His footsteps, the soft scuff of leather on marble, were the only sound as he descended deeper into the bowels of the Vatican through corridors that had not seen sunlight in 500 years. He passed rows upon incalculable rows of shelves, holding the collective memory of an empire of faith. Finally, he reached a heavy, iron-studded door. He produced a large, ornate key, its metal cold to the touch, and turned the lock. The groan of the ancient mechanism was like a sigh from a long-dead giant. He entered the inner sanctum, a small, circular room where the air was perfectly climate-controlled, still and silent as a tomb. In the center of the room, on a marble pedestal, sat a single book. It was not large, nor was it adorned with gold or jewels. It was bound in cracked, blackened leather, its title, Liber Prophetiae de Summis Pontificibus, barely legible. The Book of Prophecies of the Supreme Pontiffs. He ran a gloved hand over the cover, feeling the weight of the centuries contained within. This was the prophecy of Saint Malachy. As a young man, Alessandro had dismissed it as folklore, a clever 16th-century forgery as most scholars claimed. But as keeper, he had studied it, lived with it, and seen its unnerving accuracy unfold time and again. He had seen the motto for John Paul I, De Medietate Lunae, from the half-moon, a man elected and deceased under a half-moon, his reign a fleeting 33 days. He had seen De Labor Solis, the labor of the sun for John Paul II, the tireless traveller born during a solar eclipse and buried during another. He had seen Gloria Olivae, the glory of the Oliver, Benedict XVI, a man of peace from the Benedictine order, the olive branch. Coincidences, perhaps. But 111 coincidences in a row began to feel like a pattern woven by the hand of God himself. Alessandro opened the book with the reverence of one touching a holy relic. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded. He turned the pages, past the cryptic, poetic phrases that had so accurately foretold the destinies of popes long dead. And then he came to the final pages, the last two entries. The first, number 111, was Gloria Olivae. The next, number 112, was different. The calm, symbolic poetry was gone. It was replaced by a frantic, sprawling script, as if the writer's hand could barely keep up with the terror of his vision. It was a paragraph, not a phrase, a scream, not a whisper. He remembered the legend of Malachy himself, the Irish monk walking the dusty roads of Rome 9 centuries ago. The story said he was suddenly seized by a force beyond his understanding. It was not a dream, it was a tearing of the veil. In a deep, terrifying trance, his mind was flooded with a torrent of images, a procession of faces, marching one after another through time, each man bearing the weight of the keys of heaven. He saw their triumphs and their sins, their moments of glory, and their hours of despair. He saw them all, a chain of souls stretching from his time to the very precipice of the end. He recorded what he saw, his hand a mere vessel for the divine fire that coursed through him, until he reached the last one, number 112. Alessandro's finger traced the ominous words, his lips moving silently, the Latin a familiar, chilling prayer on his tongue. In persecutione extrema, SRS debit. Petrus Romanus, qui passet ovs in multi-tribulationibus, quibus transacti civitas septicolis diretur, iudex tremendus judicabi populum suam. Finis. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep in many tribulations, and when these things are done, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The end. The end. 2 words that had haunted Alessandro's nightmares for decades. Today, the final link in that prophetic chain had not just been tested, it had shattered. Pope Francis was the 112th pope, counted from Celestine II, just as the prophecy demarcated, and with his death the list was complete. The book was finished. Outside, a peal of thunder rattled the very foundations of the Vatican. As if on cue, the great bells of St. Peter's began to toll, their deep, bronze voices carrying across the rain-lashed city. The sound vibrated through the floor, up through Alessandro's weary bones. The world would hear the bells and mourn the passing of a beloved pontiff. But Alessandro heard something else. He heard a countdown reaching 0. He heard a lock clicking open on a door that should never have been opened. It was not a bell of mourning, it was a bell of warning, and as its sound faded into the storm, an even more terrifying silence descended. The silence of what comes next. The tolling of the bell faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it had its own weight. In his subterranean sanctum, Father Alessandro felt the cold seep not from the stone, but from the parchment before him. The prophecy wasn't just a grim prediction, it was a lock, and for centuries no one had found the key. Now, in the stark reality of the Pope's death, the tumblers were falling into place with a series of chilling metallic clicks. Looking back, the clues had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, dismissed as poetry or coincidence. 3 specific, irrefutable details that formed a threefold knot, tying Pope Francis to the final terrifying verse. The first piece of the puzzle was the easiest, a cold, hard number, 112. The prophecy of Malachy began its count with Celestine II. Chronologers and historians, both devout and skeptical, had tracked the lineage. Popes, anti-popes, short reigns and long ones. The list had been scrutinized for centuries. And there was no ambiguity. Pope Francis Jorge Mario Bergoglio was undeniably the 112th pontiff on that list. For generations, this fact had been a curiosity, a footnote for apocalyptic theorists. Now, it was the foundation stone of a terrifying reality. The chain had reached its final link, but it was the second clue that had always been the great stumbling block, the detail that allowed skeptics to sleep at night. Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. For centuries, the faithful had imagined the final pope would be an Italian cardinal, perhaps even a native of Rome itself, who would choose the name Peter II. It was expected to be obvious, a clear sign for all to see. But prophecies, Alessandro knew, rarely speak in prose. They whisper in symbols, their truths veiled until the moment of their fulfillment. How could Francis, the man from Buenos Aires, be the Roman? He was the first non-European pope in over a millennium. The world had celebrated him as a figure from the new world, a break from the old guard. The prophecy seemed on this point to have failed, but it hadn't. It had simply been more subtle, more profound. Alessandro's mind drifted to a worn black and white photograph he had once seen in a Vatican exhibit. It showed a young couple, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and fear, standing on the deck of a ship departing the port of Genoa. They were Mario José Bergoglio and Regina Maria Sivori, Francis's parents. They were not Argentinian, they were Italian, fleeing a nation bleeding from the wounds of poverty and the creeping shadow of fascism. They were children of Piedmont, their roots sunk deep in the ancient soil of northern Italy. In their hearts and in their blood, they carried Rome with them. They were not just immigrants seeking a better life. They were a living, breathing piece of Italy, transplanted to a foreign shore. Francis was not born within the Aurelian walls, but Rome was his inheritance. It was in the language he first spoke, the lullabies his mother sang, the faith passed down through generations. He was Roman by lineage, by blood memory, by the spiritual DNA that connected him directly back to the heart of the Church. The prophecy had not spoken of a birthplace, but of an origin, and Francis's origin, the very essence of who he was inextricably, fundamentally Roman. The world saw an Argentinian, but heaven saw a son of Italy, returning to claim his prophesied seat. This realization alone was unsettling, but it was the third clue, the name Petrus, that formed the final, unbreakable seal on the prophecy's truth. His name was not Peter. At birth, he was Jorge. As Pope, he chose Francis. Again, the prophecy seemed to have erred. It was this point that had given Alessandro the most comfort over the years, a clear discrepancy. He now saw his comfort had been built on ignorance. He remembered the scene in the Sistine Chapel, the moment after the white smoke had billowed from the chimney. The cardinals asking the newly elected pontiff, "Quo nomine vis vocari?" By what name do you wish to be called? The world expected a name of power, a Leo, a Pius, a Benedict, a name that spoke of doctrine and authority. But Jorge Mario Bergoglio did not hesitate. He looked not to the thrones of his predecessors, but to a humble saint from Assisi. "Franciscum," he replied, Francis. He chose the saint of the poor, the outcast, the leper, the man who rebuilt the church not with gold, but with his bare hands and his unwavering faith. It was a statement of intent, a declaration of a papacy of humility and service. The world saw this and applauded, but they missed the secret hidden within the choice. They missed the divine masterstroke. For who was this saint? Francis of Assisi. His name at birth was not Francis. It was Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone, John, son of Peter. The name was right there, a secret hidden in the heart of his chosen identity. He had cloaked himself in the name of the pauper saint, and in doing so unknowingly revealed his prophetic name, Peter's son, Petrus. Alessandro felt a chill run down his spine. It was a level of symbolism so intricate, so perfectly concealed, that it could not be mere chance. It was the work of a divine playwright, crafting a story over 900 years. Francis was number 112. He was Roman in his blood. And he bore the name of Peter, not emblazoned on his standard, but woven into the very fabric of his spiritual identity. The threefold knot was tied, and the prophecy contained one final, chilling descriptor for this man's reign. He will pasture his sheep in many tribulations. It was never destined to be a time of peace. Alessandro thought of Francis's life. The first tribulation had come long before the papacy, a personal crucible of pain. As a young man in Argentina, a brutal lung infection had nearly claimed his life. He remembered the stories of the agonizing surgery, the removal of a part of his right lung, the long days spent gasping for breath in a sterile hospital room. It was there, in that confrontation with his own fragility, that his journey was truly forged. He learned that life was a gift, each breath a small miracle. He did not pray for his pain to end, but for it to have meaning. That personal tribulation was but a foreshadowing of the institutional one he would inherit. He took the throne of a church on fire, battered by scandals that had shattered the faith of millions. He faced a Vatican mired in internal power struggles, a bitter war of whispers and accusations between progressives and traditionalists. His every move was scrutinized, his every word twisted. He was the Pope of mercy in an age that craved judgment, a builder of bridges in a world determined to build walls. The tribulations were not a possibility. They were the very definition of his time. They were the cross he was destined to bear, and now that time was over. The shepherd had been called home, but the prophecy did not end with his death. His death was merely the prerequisite. The tolling bell was not an epilogue. It was the prologue to the final act. The storm outside seemed to intensify, its fury a physical manifestation of the turmoil Pope Francis had faced from his very first day on the chair of St. Peter. The phrase "in multis tribulationibus," in many tribulations, was not just prophetic, it was a painfully accurate summary of his pontificate. Father Alessandro, still standing in the cold silence of the archive, felt the weight of those years settle upon him. He had been a first-hand witness, a quiet observer from within the Vatican's ancient walls to the relentless storms that had battered this pope. The tribulations began not with a bang, but with a quiet resistance, a subtle poison that spread through the veins of the curia. Francis was an outsider in every sense of the word. He was the first Jesuit pope, an order viewed with historical suspicion by some factions for its independence and intellectual rigor. He was the first from the Americas, a man whose worldview was shaped not in the hallowed halls of European seminaries, but in the sprawling, often chaotic barrios of Buenos Aires. He didn't look right. He didn't act right. From day one, he broke with the suffocating pageantry of the papacy. He refused the opulent red ceremonial cape, the mozzetta, choosing the simple white cassock. He turned his back on the vast, lonely apostolic palace, opting instead to live in the modest Domus Sanctae Marthae guest house, where he ate his meals in the common dining hall alongside visiting priests and laypeople. He didn't speak in the flowery academic Latin of his predecessors, but in a plain, direct Italian, often improvising, speaking from the heart. He didn't impose rules. He asked questions. These weren't mere stylistic choices. They were a revolution, and every revolution has its counter-revolutionaries. The first great public wound was the one he inherited, the global scourge of sexual abuse. The crisis had festered for decades, a cancer of institutional silence and clerical protectionism. Victims, for so long ignored and shamed, were now raising their voices in a chorus of pain and righteous anger that could no longer be silenced. The cry for justice was a roar that echoed from Ireland to Australia, from the United States to Chile. Francis did not shy away. Alessandro recalled the profound, almost unbearable sorrow in the Pope's eyes during his meetings with survivors. He didn't offer platitudes or legalistic defenses. He listened. He wept openly with them, his shoulders shaking with a grief that seemed to absorb their own. He publicly begged for forgiveness on behalf of the Church, calling the abuse a sacrilegious cult. He initiated reforms, creating commissions and new canonical laws to dismantle the culture of impunity. But it was like trying to turn an ocean liner with a canoe paddle. For every step forward, he met a wall of resistance. Behind every case lay entrenched power structures, hidden networks of loyalty, and a deep-seated instinct within the institution to protect itself above all else. The tribulation was not just the scandal itself, but the brutal, soul-crushing fight for transparency against the darkness within his own house. On top of this festering wound came another, a deep and bitter internal polarization. The cracks within the Church widened into chasms. Tensions between so-called progressives and conservatives, once whispered in corridors, were now shouted in public forums and splashed across headlines. Alessandro remembered the exact moment the battle lines were drawn. It was on the return flight from his first apostolic trip to Brazil in 2013. A journalist asked him about gay priests. His response would become the most famous and most controversial of his papacy. If someone is gay and he searches for the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge? To millions around the world, it was a breath of fresh air, a moment of profound pastoral charity. But to the Church's most conservative factions, it was heresy. They saw it as the first step down a slippery slope toward relativism, an abandonment of moral clarity. They began to see him not as a shepherd, but as a threat. Open letters from cardinals demanding clarifications were published. Anonymous posters appeared on the walls of Rome, accusing him of dismantling the faith. He was accused of ambiguity, of promoting a false mercy that ignored sin. They compared him to the most liberal of his predecessors, and some, in hushed and bitter tones, even compared him to Luther. Yet, through it all, Francis rarely, if ever, responded to his critics directly. He absorbed the attacks with a serene, almost unnerving calm. Alessandro would see him walking in the Vatican gardens, his face etched with weariness but his eyes still clear, his steps steady. He was guided by a conviction far stronger than the noise of his detractors. He knew he had not come to please the powerful, but to serve the forgotten. He knew that any true reform must first hurt, must first tear away the diseased tissue before new life can blossom. He pushed forward with his vision of a synodal church that walks together, that listens. It was a concept that unsettled the rigid hierarchy. He insisted on hearing the voices of ordinary people, of women, of the laity, of those who had never before been given a seat at the table. He envisioned a less clerical, more collaborative church, a field hospital for the wounded, not a fortress for the righteous. He opened doors to the divorced and remarried, to those who felt cast aside. It was not a political strategy. It was for him a radical act of conversion back to the gospel. This internal struggle was mirrored by the chaos of the world outside. His papacy unfolded against a backdrop of unprecedented global turmoil. New wars erupted. Christians faced brutal persecution in the ancient lands of their faith. The planet itself seemed to groan under the weight of the climate crisis, and a wave of aggressive secularism sought to push faith out of the public square entirely. The tribulations were not just within the church walls, they were everywhere. And then, in 2020, came the tribulation that brought the world to its knees. The pandemic. COVID-19 emptied the pews, halted the pilgrimages, and locked humanity in a state of suspended animation. Alessandro would never forget that night in March, the rain-soaked, hauntingly empty St. Peter's Square. Francis, a solitary white figure, walking slowly, limping under a dark, weeping sky. He stood alone, facing the exposed Eucharist, the silence of the square, amplifying the desperate silence of a terrified world. It was a visual representation of humanity's collective soul, wounded, isolated and afraid. In that moment of profound darkness, when it seemed that even God had hidden his face, the Pope raised his voice, raw with emotion, and declared, "We are not alone." It was the shepherd, standing firm in the heart of the storm, keeping watch over a flock scattered by fear. That was his pontificate. A litany of tribulations. And now, just as foretold, it was over. His watch had ended, and Alessandro knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the greatest tribulation was yet to come. The prophecy of Malachy did not conclude with the death of the final shepherd. His passing was not the end, but a trigger. It was the last sentence, the final, devastating clause that now consumed Father Alessandro's thoughts, echoing in the tomb-like silence of the archive. Quibus transactis civitas septicolis diruetur, iudex tremendus iudicabit populum suum. Finis. And when these things are done, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The end. The city of 7 hills. There was no ambiguity in this phrase, no need for symbolic interpretation. For 2 millennia, that name had meant only one place, Rome. The eternal city, the seat of emperors and popes, the heart of an empire, and the bedrock of Western Christendom. The city Malachy himself had walked when the vision seized him. The same city that, at this very moment, was slick with a rain that felt like a portent. The prophecy declared that this city, the nexus of history, faith and power, would be destroyed. Alessandro's mind, trained in history and theology, raced through the possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. The literal destruction of Rome? It seemed unthinkable, like something from a disaster movie, not a theological reality. Yet history was littered with the ruins of eternal cities. Jerusalem, Babylon, Carthage. Pride always precedes the fall. Could it be fire, war, a new, terrible weapon unleashed upon the world? Or perhaps something more insidious? An earthquake, a geological cataclysm that would shatter the ancient monuments and bury 2,000 years of history under rubble and dust. The thought of the Colosseum collapsing, of St. Peter's Dome shattering into 1,000,000 pieces, was a sacrilege almost too great to contemplate. But as he stared at the spidery script, another interpretation began to surface, a fear subtler and perhaps even more profound. The destruction might not be physical, it might be spiritual. He thought of the Book of Revelation, the other great prophetic text that had haunted the dreams of the faithful for centuries. St. John's vision of the whore of Babylon, the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth seated upon 7 hills. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Revelation 17-9. For centuries, theologians had debated this figure. Some saw it as a symbol of pagan Rome, others of a future apostate world power. But the connection was undeniable. A city on 7 hills associated with worldly power and destined for a catastrophic fall. Could the destruction be the collapse of Rome as the spiritual center of the world? A hollowing out of its authority, an implosion of its influence, leaving behind nothing but a magnificent empty museum. A city of silent basilicas and vacant palaces, its spiritual power extinguished, its moral authority shattered beyond repair. A city that had lost its soul. In an age of dwindling faith and rampant secularism, this spiritual demolition seemed not only possible, but perhaps already underway. The empty pews, the shuttered monasteries, the growing indifference of a world that no longer looked to Rome for answers. Were these not the sounds of foundations cracking, The prophecy's final phrase hammered the point home with terrifying finality. And the dreadful judge will judge his people. Iudex tremendus, the dreadful judge. The words evoked the ancient hymn of the Requiem Mass, the Dies Irae. Dies Irae, dies illa, solvit sacrum in favilla. A day of wrath that day will dissolve the world in ash. This was not about politics or the fall of an institution. This was about a final divine reckoning. And the judgment was not just for the outsiders, the pagans, the enemies of the faith. The text was specific. Judicabit populum suum. He will judge his people. It was a warning directed inward, a judgment beginning at the house of God. It implied a sifting, a purification of the faithful themselves, a separation of the wheat from the chaff. It suggested that the true tribulation was not the persecution from without, but the test of faith from within. Who would stand firm when the shepherd was gone and the wolves began to circle? Who would hold to the truth when the world offered 1,000 comforting lies? The weight of this revelation was crushing. For centuries, the Malachy prophecy had been treated by many, even within the Vatican, as a historical curiosity, a piece of medieval legend. But its unnerving accuracy had slowly transformed it from folklore into a terrifyingly prescient document. Alessandro's predecessors had documented the uncanny connections, and he himself had seen the last few fall into place. He thought of John Paul I, de mediatate lunae, the half-moon pope. Not only was his reign bookended by half-moons, but his papacy itself was a half-measure, a brief, mysterious interlude. His sudden death after only 33 days remains shrouded in conspiracy theories to this day, a papacy that was indeed but a sliver of its potential, like a half-moon in the night sky. Then John Paul II, de labor solis, the labor of the sun. Caro vogitua, born on the day of a solar eclipse. His entire life was a tireless sun-like journey, traversing the globe, his light shining in the darkest corners of the Cold War. He was a relentless sun, burning with energy until the very end, his death also occurring during the season of eclipses. And Benedict XVI, Gloria Olivae, the glory of the olive. A man of peace, a Benedictine at heart, an order symbolized by the olive branch. His theology was a balm of intellectual calm and depth. Even his choice of a papal name, Benedict, founder of the order, seemed a deliberate nod to the prophecy, as if the German shepherd himself, the great theologian, saw the writing on the wall and chose to acknowledge it. These were not vague interpretations forced onto history. They were precise, poetic, and eerily specific. Over and over for 900 years the prophecy had held true. And if the first 111 predictions were correct, what sane man would dare to bet that the 112th, the most detailed and terrifying of them all, was wrong? The death of Pope Francis wasn't just the closing of a chapter. It had, as Alessandro feared, opened a terrifying new one. A chasm of uncertainty had cracked open beneath the feet of the world. The bells had stopped tolling, but a new sound was beginning to echo in the silence. It was the sound of approaching footstep, the footstep of the one who would come next. And the most terrifying question of all began to form in Alessandro's mind. If Francis was the last legitimate pope on the list, who or what was coming to sit on the empty throne of Peter? The air in the archive felt heavy, charged with unspoken questions. If Francis was the last link in the prophetic chain, the final name on Malachy's list, then the conclave that would soon assemble was not just another election. It was a leap into a terrifying, uncharted void. The question hanging in the chilling silence was no longer who would be the next pope, but if there would be another legitimate pope at all, or would the throne of Peter, for the first time in 2 millennia, be occupied by an impostor? For a small, scattered community of scholars, theologians, and devout believers who had studied these prophecies for years, the answer was horrifyingly clear. They were not fringe conspiracists, but sober-minded men and women of deep faith, like Father Alessandro, who had connected the dots between Malachy, Scripture, and the unfolding signs of the times. For them, the successor to Francis would not be a shepherd. He would be the fulfillment of a different, far darker prophecy. He would be the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing. Alessandro's thoughts turned inevitably to the 13th chapter of the Book of Revelation. The imagery, once allegorical and distant, now felt chillingly immediate. Saint. John describes the rise of a second beast, one that comes out of the earth. Unlike the first beast, which rises from the sea representing secular political power, this second one has a religious guise. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. Revelation 13:11. Like a lamb. He would appear gentle, devout, pastoral. He would likely speak of peace, unity, and social justice. He would charm the world with his humility and charisma. His horns, symbols of power, would be small and unassuming like those of a lamb. He would not present himself as a conqueror, but as a healer, a unifier for a fractured world and a wounded church. He would be everything the world thinks it wants in a spiritual leader, but he would speak like a dragon. Beneath the surface of his comforting words, his message would be one of deception. His mission would not be to lead souls to God, but to lead them to worship the first beast, the global secular power. He would perform great signs, perhaps miracles of a sort, that would dazzle and deceive even the most discerning. His ultimate goal: to create a one-world religion, a spiritual system that erases all distinctions and subsumes all faiths into a bland humanistic ideology that serves a global government. He would be the great deceiver, the false prophet. Questions began to pile up in Alessandro's mind, each one a stone sinking into the pit of his stomach. Could this new leader, soon to be chosen in the Sistine Chapel, be the one who prepares the way for the Antichrist? Is this the great apostasy, the great falling away from the faith that the Apostle Paul warned of? Alessandro reached for another ancient text on his shelf, a worn copy of the epistles. His fingers found the passage in Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, a warning he had read 100 times, but which now seemed to burn on the page. Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come, unless the rebellion apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. 2 Thessalonians 2-3. The man of lawlessness, the son of destruction. Paul described a figure who would oppose and exalt himself above every so-called god or object of worship, to the point that he would take his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. A false faith, led by a false leader, paving the way for a false god. The prophecy of Saint Malachy was not an isolated prediction. It was the final puzzle piece locking into the grand, terrifying mosaic of biblical eschatology. And the warnings were not just in the ancient texts. They were in the words of Jesus himself. Alessandro's mind replayed the solemn discourse from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24. Jesus' disciples had asked him for the signs of his coming and of the end of the age. His answer was not a single event, but a sequence, a series of birth pangs. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Matthew 24:6-8. Alessandro looked at the world beyond his stone walls. It was all there. He didn't need to read it in a book. He could see it on the news every night. Nations on the brink of global conflict. A planet groaning with unprecedented natural disasters, fires, floods, storms of terrifying intensity. A global pandemic that had revealed the fragility of modern civilization, and a moral and spiritual corruption that spread like an invisible odorless gas, suffocating truth and celebrating vice. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a sequence, unfolding just as described 2,000 years ago. For decades, these verses had felt like distant thunder, warnings for a far-off, future generation. But tonight, after the death of Francis, the 112th Pope, the storm felt like it was directly overhead. The wind was howling, the lightning was striking closer and closer. The birth pains were no longer a faint ache. They were intense, undeniable contractions. The great apostasy would be revealed, the man of lawlessness would rise, and the false prophet, with the gentle face of a lamb and the venomous tongue of a dragon, would soon take his seat on the throne of Peter. He would not come bearing a sword but a smile. He would not demand worship through force, but earn it through seduction. He would speak the language of the modern world: tolerance, inclusion, dialogue, and use those very words to gut the faith of its eternal truths. A terrible thought gripped Alessandro. He looked at the book of Malachy, at the final, grim word, finis, the end. He had always assumed it meant the end of the world. But what if it meant something else? What if it simply meant the end of the papacy? The end of the line of legitimate successors to Saint Peter? The final, awful fulfillment of Jesus' promise to Peter was that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church, not necessarily against the physical institution in Rome. The church, the body of true believers, would endure, but its earthly headquarters could fall. The conclave would meet. They would pray for the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and they would elect a man. The world would watch, and most would rejoice. But Alessandro and the few others who understood the signs would be watching for something different. They would be watching for the horns of a lamb and listening for the voice of a dragon. Amidst the swirling vortex of apocalyptic fear, Father Alessandro forced himself to take a slow, deep breath. The scent of old parchment and beeswax filled his lungs, a familiar anchor in the storm of his thoughts. Fear, he knew, was the dragon's native tongue. It paralyzed, it isolated, it blinded, and it was the one thing Pope Francis had spent his entire pontificate fighting against. The thought of the late Pope, not as a prophetic symbol but as a man, brought a wave of profound sorrow that momentarily eclipsed the dread. His death may have marked the end of an era foretold, but it was not the end of faith. True faith, Francis always taught, is not an institution of stone and gold. It is a fire in the human heart. It does not die with men, no matter how holy. It is tested in the crucible of trial, and it is in the deepest darkness that its light shines most brightly. The current moment, Alessandro realized, was not a call to despair, but a call to awaken. A desperate, urgent summons to shake off the spiritual slumber of complacency, to turn back toward God, not with ritual, but with the sincerity, humility, and urgency of a soul who knows the hour is late. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. The words of Christ resonated not as a threat, but as an act of mercy, a final chance to prepare. This was the true legacy of Pope Francis. It was something far more enduring than the monuments his predecessors had built. He didn't leave behind grand basilicas or masterful encyclicals on obscure points of doctrine. He left behind something far harder to build and utterly impossible to destroy, a living example. He was the Pope who broke the chains of protocol to open the doors of the Church. He stepped down from the gilded papal balcony to meet people where they were, face to face, in the messiness of their lives. He was the one who descended into the grim, forgotten prisons on Holy Thursday to wash the feet of inmatesmen and women, Christians and Muslims, a gesture so profoundly Christ-like it scandalized the traditionalists. They saw a breach of liturgical law. The world saw the gospel made visible. He chose listening over imposing. In a world saturated with shouting, his silence was often his most powerful statement. He favored the integrity of a difficult truth over the easy applause of a comfortable lie. His entire pontificate could be seen as a relentless effort to restore to the world the most authentic and therefore most challenging image of Christianity. He tirelessly repeated that the face of God is not found in power, but in vulnerability, not in wealth, but in poverty, not in the righteous, but in those who suffer. Francis reformed the Church not merely through decrees and appointments, but by attempting to instill a new culture, the culture of encounter. He championed mercy as the beating heart of the Christian message. This was not a cheap grace that excused sin, but a radical, transformative love that never condemned the sinner. His episcopal motto, chosen as a young bishop, had been the key to his entire life. Miserando atque eligendo, by having mercy and by choosing him. The phrase, from a homily by the Venerable Bede, describes the moment Jesus saw Matthew, the tax collector, a sinner, a collaborator, a social outcast, and called him to be an apostle. Jesus did not see a sinner to be condemned. He saw a soul to be loved. This was the logic Francis tried to live by. He sent out missionaries of mercy, priests authorized to forgive even those grave sins normally reserved for the apostolic see. He called on confessors to act less like judges administering a test and more like fathers welcoming a lost child home. He visited refugee camps, embracing those the world saw as a problem. He held the hands of the sick in hospitals, seeing in their suffering a reflection of the crucified Christ. Every gesture, every word, every silence conveyed the same message. Mercy is not weakness. It is the strongest face of love. It is the face of God himself. And his quest for encounter did not stop at the Church's borders. In one of his most daring journeys, he traveled to Iraq, a land ravaged by war and extremism, a place where no pope had ever set foot. There, surrounded by the rubble of ancient churches and the ghosts of martyrs, he met with Christian and Muslim leaders, his voice passionate as he called for a coexistence stronger than fear. He extended a hand to the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, the highest authority in Sunni Islam, and together they signed a historic document on human fraternity, a groundbreaking appeal for peace that transcended religious boundaries. He wept before the cold, grey walls of Auschwitz, embracing survivors of the Holocaust. He built bridges with Orthodox Christians, culminating in a landmark event in Cuba, the first meeting and embrace between a Roman pontiff and the Patriarch of Moscow in over 1,000 years of schism. He knew the wounds of division were ancient and deep, but he believed the work of healing had to start somewhere, with one handshake, one embrace, one shared prayer at a time. This was his painful, controversial, and relentlessly demanding leadership. He led the flock through the darkness, not by promising an easy path, but by walking with them on the difficult one. He was the shepherd who, as the prophecy said, pastured his sheep through many tribulations, and now his mission was fulfilled. After a life marked by trial, sacrifice, and a courage that often looked like reckless love, he had gone to meet the God he served so faithfully. Alessandro closed the prophetic book. The fear for the future was real, a cold knot in his stomach, but interwoven with it was a thread of gratitude for the past. Francis had not left the flock defenseless. He had rearmed them with the only weapons that would matter in the times to come: mercy, humility, and a radical faith in a God who never abandons his people, even when the world seems to be ending. A quiet prayer formed on Alessandro's lips. May his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen. May heaven welcome him with open arms, the humble servant who bore the weight of the world on his stooped shoulders. Rest in peace, Francis, you have earned it. Days turned into a week. The world outside the Vatican walls moved through the prescribed stages of official mourning. Dignitaries from every nation arrived in Rome, their private jets lining the tarmac at Ciampino Airport. News channels ran endless retrospectives, their montages of Pope Francis visiting slums, embracing the disabled, laughing with children now tinged with a solemn historical weight. St. Peter's Square, once hauntingly empty in the rain, was now an ocean of humanity. Tens of thousands of pilgrims stood for hours in snaking lines, waiting patiently for a final chance to file past the body of the late pontiff, to offer a prayer, to say a silent goodbye. From his cloistered vantage point, Father Alessandro watched the spectacle with a sense of profound detachment. He saw the genuine grief on the faces of the ordinary people, the raw personal loss. He also saw the calculated solemnity of the politicians and the frenetic energy of the media. The world was mourning the man, but it was blissfully, terrifyingly unaware of the prophecy he had fulfilled. They were preparing for a funeral and a conclave, seeing it as the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Alessandro knew it was the closing of the entire book. The cardinals of the church gathered in Rome, their scarlet robes a splash of vibrant color against the city's somber gray. They met in their general congregations, preliminary meetings, to discuss the state of the church and the challenges facing the next pope. Alessandro, through his contacts in the Curia, heard the whispers. The usual factions were forming. The progressives, determined to continue Francis's legacy of pastoral openness; the conservatives, seeing this as a critical opportunity to restore doctrinal rigidity and tradition; and the moderates, the diplomats, looking for a candidate who could bridge the divide and heal the fractured institution. They spoke of the needs of the church in Africa, the rise of secularism in Europe, the political complexities of dealing with China, the ongoing financial reforms of the Vatican Bank. They were acting as if this was business as usual. They were arranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Alessandro did not fear a specific candidate. He feared the spirit that was moving among them, a spirit of worldly calculation disguised as divine discernment. The pressure from the outside world for a modern pope, one who would bend to the prevailing cultural winds, was immense. The pressure from within for a strong pope, one who would reassert power and discipline, was equally fierce. In this crucible of political and ideological pressure, how could the quiet whisper of the Holy Spirit be heard? It was the perfect environment for the Lamb with the dragon's voice to emerge. He would be the perfect compromise candidate, calming, eloquent, seemingly orthodox, but with a core of pleasing ambiguity. He would be all things to all men, and therefore loyal to none but himself and the power he served. On the morning the conclave was to begin, Alessandro did not go to the edge of the square to watch the procession. Instead, he retreated to a small, private chapel deep within the archives, a place few even knew existed. It was bare, adorned only with a simple wooden cross and a single flickering candle. He knelt on the cold stone floor, the ancient book of Malachy resting on the simple altar before him, not as an object of study, but as a relic of a finished age. He did not pray for the cardinals. He felt, with a terrible certainty, that their choice was already preordained by a script written long ago. Instead, he prayed for the flock, for the ordinary believers around the world who would soon look to a new shepherd, unaware of the shadow that lay upon him. He prayed for the priests in lonely rural parishes, for the nuns running clinics in war-torn nations, for the families struggling to teach their children the faith in a hostile world. He prayed that they would be given the grace of discernment, the strength to cling to the true Christ, even if his vicar on earth was a mirage. He prayed for the legacy of Francis, that the seeds of mercy he had planted would not be uprooted and cast aside. He prayed that the fire of authentic faith, the one Francis had so carefully fanned, would not be extinguished, but would instead be scattered, carried like embers by the faithful into the coming darkness, becoming 1,000 small points of light in a world growing dim. Hours passed. The sun set, and the lights of Rome began to glitter. From his chapel window, Alessandro could see the temporary chimney installed on the roof of the Sistine Chapel, a thin black pipe silhouetted against the twilight sky. The world's eyes were fixed on that chimney, waiting for a puff of smoke. He remained on his knees, his vigil a silent act of resistance. He was just one old man, a keeper of dusty books, a forgotten cog in a vast machine. But he knew the truth. And in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth even, if only to oneself, in the silence of a hidden chapel is a revolutionary act. Suddenly, a distant roar from the square reached him. It was a sound he knew well. He stood up, his old bones creaking, and looked out the window. White smoke, thick, billowing, unmistakable white smoke, was pouring from the chimney. Habemus Papam, we have a pope. The bells of St. Peter's began to peal, this time not with the slow, mournful toll of death, but with a joyous, triumphant clangor that echoed across the 7 hills. But to Alessandro, the sound was not joyful. It was a shriek. It was the sound of the final seal breaking. He did not move to the balcony or turn on the radio. He had no need to know the man's name or see his face. It didn't matter. The prophecy was fulfilled. The last shepherd was gone. The throne was now occupied. The age of tribulations had ended. The age of judgment had begun. He turned from the window, back to the single candle flickering in the darkness of his chapel. The world outside was celebrating a new dawn, but Alessandro knew better. This was not the dawn. This was the deepest part of the night, the moment just before the true judge would return. And all that was left to do was watch and pray, and keep the flame of faith alive, however small, until the real morning came.